Good morning. We're glad to have you. This is Kelly Hall, President and CEO of the Longview Chamber. I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available online at the longviewchamber.com website. And for those of you online, you will receive an email later today with a link to listen to the program again. Plus, we'd like for you to share this information with colleagues and friends across East Texas. Next, there are a couple of features I'd like to make you aware of. Please find the chat and question icons. You can type in both features to the organizer. The purpose of chat today is to make the organizer aware there are issues with the broadcast. The question feature is for you to ask questions of the presenters throughout the presentation. Presenters will be answering the questions when they get done. So we have 3 speakers today, and at the conclusion of each speaker, we'll take time for Q&A before the next presentation. Lastly, you will be muted throughout the presentation. I want you to know I'm disappointed that we're not in DC right now. The U.S. Chamber has the coolest building, and they've been renovating their building. And when you walk in their front doors, right on the right, guess what you get to see? A huge picture of our building, and it says Longview Chamber of Commerce right there in downtown Washington, D.C. It is the coolest thing to see. And by the time we get there, those pieces may be gone because they've continued with their building renovations. So we'll see what happens this spring when we go to DC for our in-person fly-in. Today's program is being brought to you by several key investors. First, Joyce Crane, plus Southwestern Electric Power Company, an AEP company, Linebarger, Goggin, Blair & Sampson, LLP, R. Manley Enterprises, Cantera, and Starfish Ad Agency. We sure do appreciate our key investors for our DC fly-in and making today's presentation possible. Our first speaker this morning from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is Kris Dubay. He is the senior economist there at the U.S. Chamber, and he's going to be talking with us about the economy and giving us that economic outlook. So Kris, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you and get this party started.
Thank you, Kelly. Really happy to be here and talk with you about the economy. So I got about 20 minutes, but I want to leave time for question and answers. So I'm going to go over some high-level stuff and then go in, if there's time, to get into a few charts that I have that really drive home the themes I'm going to hit today. So from a high level, it's important to remember that the virus is driving the economy. This is a really kind of unique situation because usually when you have an economic event like we've just gone through, think about the Great Depression and the Great Recession from 2007 and 2009. And by the way, it's not hyperbolic to compare what we've gone through to those major economic events because we had a contraction at those levels and actually above. But usually those things happen because of something that occurs inside the economy. The Great Recession occurred because of financial issues. Great Recession, same thing, and it took a long time to work those things out. This happens from something that occurred outside the economy. It's a virus imposing its will on the economy, and that's unusual. The good news is when you have an exogenous, what economists would call an exogenous shock that came from outside, the good news is that we know how to get the economy going. When you have something that occurs like a financial crisis, a lot of uncertainty about how to get past it and get the economy growing again. We know how to do this. We know how to get the economy growing right now because we know what we know is that we have to get past the virus. The trick is that we don't know how to do that necessarily. We know that when we do get past it, that the economy will get back to health. We've rebounded pretty strongly, which is really good news. That the optimistic good news out of this is that we've seen again that the U.S. economy is incredibly resilient, and we've had a good strong bounce back. The other good news, well, and the tendency of the U.S. economy is to grow. So that's the good news. And we haven't had any other imbalances or bubbles created because of the recession that we have gone through. Usually when you have a recession, especially the depth that we had, you see things get exposed. and that creates other problems. So think about the financial crisis of 2007, triggers a housing crisis, leaks over into the other areas of the economy, and it takes a long time to work those issues out. That hasn't happened here. Really, really good news. And I think, believe it or not, I don't think you hear a lot of people praising Washington, and I don't want to praise Washington writ large, but I think the response from on the monetary and the fiscal side has been pretty strong. So the Fed has done a really good job on the monetary side. They flooded the financial markets with liquidity. They learned the lessons of the Great Depression and the Great Recession really well. They knew what to do back in 2007 and to 2009, but they didn't have the facilities and the mechanisms set up to do it quickly. They got those set up on an ad hoc basis. This time they had them ready to go. They knew what to do. They had the mechanisms they needed to do them, and they did it right away. So in March and April, they acted very aggressively, and they've prevented a broader financial crisis from occurring because of a very severe recession. Other side, the fiscal side, Congress and the administration actually did a pretty good job through the CARES Act, getting money to impacted families. So we had the pandemic relief payments at $1,200 per person. We had the extra unemployment benefits at $600 per week, which was generous, but was very helpful. And then we had the PPP program for businesses to pay payroll, to pay their overhead expenses. So that went a long way to keeping the economy from falling further and putting on a path for a more resiliency to bounce back stronger once we finally do get past the virus. It's also interesting that we before this all started, or when it all started, we were talking about what shape would the recovery take, or so would we have a very steep drop in the economy followed by a very steep recovery, a V-shaped event? Would we have an L? Would we go down and stay down for a while? Would it be a U? Would it go down, stay down, and come back up? What it turns out we've had is a K-shaped, which is a little confusing. I had to kind of dig into that and figure out what that means. Think about a K, and if you cut it in half horizontally, you get some businesses that are on the top part of the K. So they've had a V-shape, they're on the top part, they fell steeply and shot back up, but others have come down and stayed down, and they're on the bottom part of the K. And it's pretty much common sense as to where businesses fall. So those that have rebounded sharply are tech businesses, retailers that can sell online and have a hybrid of online and brick and mortar. Those on the bottom, airlines, travel tourism, events, food and beverage, those services that in businesses that just cannot operate in the midst of a pandemic. Either they can't operate at all or they have to operate at reduced capacity. And I'll get more into the K-shape as we go. Before I do that, rates versus levels is the last thing I wanted to hit on before I walk you through a few slides. When you talk about economic data in the next couple, several months and years, it's really going to be important to look at rates versus levels. So we're going to have record high growth rates for things like jobs and GDP, but the levels of those data points are still going to be below where we were prior to the pandemic. So to get a real sense of where we are, you need to look at both. You need to look at the rate of change and the level, and I've got some charts that will show that. So I'm going to go ahead and pull these charts up. Hopefully you'll be able to see them. Okay, there we go. Hopefully you're seeing the charts now. I think you should be. If you're not seeing a PowerPoint, someone chime in and let me know. So let's. I only got a couple minutes, so let me get right to. I'll start with consumer sentiment and do this fairly quickly. I put this up here again to show you the virus driving the economy. Consumer sentiment, how consumers feel about the economy, the stronger they feel about the economy, the more they're going to spend. Pretty straightforward. As you can see, it was doing pretty well back in February, fell off a cliff in March and April. Then it rebounded as the virus fell a little bit in May and into June. But then as we had the resurgence in the South and in the West, consumer sentiment fell in July, kind of stayed down in August. The virus has fallen back a little bit, and the consumer sentiment has rebounded. So that's good. The headline numbers, this is from last week, was that consumer sentiment rose sharply, and it did. But if you look at the data, the arrow, we're still well below where we were prior to the pandemic. So this is a good one to show both rates versus levels, and as the virus goes, so too does the economy. Here's another good one to show, again, how strongly the virus weighs on the economy, but also the rates versus level. So this is the job market. Back in February, just a few short months ago, there were 152.4, almost 5 million jobs in the economy. So 152 million jobs, and that it took a long time to get there. So it took from the recession that ended in June of 2009 to February of 2020. So almost 11 full years of growth. That was the longest economic expansion in post-World War II history. Almost 11 full years, and was going to keep going if this pandemic hadn't hit. Took us that long to get a job market that was that large. Really, unfortunately, a side effect is what has happened to the lowest skilled workers. Back in February, those were the ones where jobs are being, the most number of jobs is being created, and was driving wages up for the lowest skilled workers, which is what everyone wanted for a really long time. And we finally had gotten there. It takes that long of an expansion to get there, and then in a few short months, all that progress was undone, unfortunately, and it's going to take a while for us to get back there. But on the rates versus levels thing, back to, so we lost 23.5 million jobs in March and April, which is just mind-blowing to lose that many jobs in a short amount of time. Now in May, June, July, and August, and September, so 5 straight months, we've had would be record high levels of job creation. So we had like 2.8 million jobs created in May, 4.8 created in June. Then we add another 1.5 million in July and August, and then 661,000 last month. So it's a lot of jobs, like 11 million jobs created over 5 months, which would be a record number. But if you look at the red part of September 20, that column, there's still almost 11 million jobs that are needed to be to fill the hole, to get back to where we were back in February. It's going to take a long time to get there, unfortunately. Real quick on the jobs report from Friday, the headline number of 661,000, a lot of disappointment. People were looking for closer to 1 million. It's not as quite as weak as, at least in my estimation, it wasn't as weak as some had said, because there were revisions from previous months for like 150,000 more positive. So you add that, it's over 800,000, and then local governments shed like 250,000 jobs in education. Now a lot of that is seasonality. It's jobs they didn't add because the schools aren't open, but that weighed heavily on the jobs number. So it wasn't quite as bad as some had said. Still, it would have been nicer to see it be stronger, but we're probably going to be in this range for the coming months as we're kind of getting into a period of static growth as we wait to get past the virus. So I'm going to just quickly go through the GDP numbers and hand it over to questions. We had a record contraction in the second quarter of over 31%, which is 3 times larger than the previous quarterly record, which was a 10% contraction in 1958, which was also caused by a pandemic. A flu pandemic in 1958 caused a 10% quarterly contraction back then. We beat that by threefold. Real quick on this is an annualized number, so we didn't lose a third of the economy in the second quarter. What that means is that the economy would have to contract by that much for 4 consecutive quarters. It's a confusing way to present it. I don't know why they do that, but they do. And so still, that's just how it's reported. It's like a fourth of that, so it's like 9% you lose in one quarter, but that is reported that way. Anyway, 31% contraction in the second quarter. The good news, the flip side of that, is most people are predicting a record high growth in the third quarter, which just ended last week. On average of the estimators that we follow, looking at about 25% growth in the third quarter, which, if they're accurate, would blow away the previous record, which was 16.7% growth back in 1950. So that's good, and you can see the path of how that might go. Again, the economy doing well at the end of 2019 and into 2021. I'm sorry, at the end of 2019 into 2020. Then you get the pandemic, and we get the steep drop. We get a steep drop in the first quarter, and then even steeper record in the second quarter. Really strong growth in the third quarter. Still pretty good growth in the fourth quarter and into 2021. However, that rates versus levels issue, even with those strong rates of growth, it's going to take until the end of next year to get back to a level of GDP we had prior to the pandemic. This will move around. This is a very sensitive analysis based on the rates that are in the previous slide. Not putting this here to pinpoint the exact time, just to show that when you have a severe contraction like we went through, it takes a long time to get back to where we were. Might get there in the middle of next year, might take until the middle of 2022. It depends on how strong those growth rates actually are. But the point is, it's going to take us a while to get there. It's a really big hole that we've dug. Last 2 points. Incomes are still elevated compared to where they were prior to the pandemic, which is kind of counterintuitive. This is government payments, the pandemic relief payments, and the extra unemployment benefits. And then, excuse me, then you add people going back to work. This will probably continue to fall, but really interesting impact of the pandemic and the government response. And one reason why you might not have seen consumption fall as the benefits have run out is people saved a lot during the pandemic. Those who are working not able to spend at the same level that they normally spend at. Those who are receiving benefits also not be able to spend it the same way that they normally would have, because how are you going to spend the same amount when you're at home? And then people also saving those government benefits because forward-looking, maybe in an industry that they know is not going to go back anytime soon, and knowing that they're going to need that support going forward, so they saved it. Savings have been coming down, but it went up like sixfold between February and April. So a lot of savings is there to help buttress consumption as we still work to get through the pandemic. With that, I'm going to stop and turn over to questions. I'll answer questions, happy to answer questions on anything I touched on, or anything I didn't get to. So look forward to your questions. Thanks.
All righty. Thank you very much for that information. And Stephanie, I'm thinking, there we go. There we go. All righty. So a couple of questions that have come up. Let's talk a little bit about the impact of the oil and gas market. I mean, oil just dived last week and slowly is coming back this week, but still not anywhere where we need it to be. How is that impacting the overall economic outlook for the country?
Well, oil and gas, obviously a very important industry and a very important sector. It's volatile, which makes it hard to predict what the impact is going to be going forward. I think it's actually flipped though. I think that it's the broader economy which impacts the oil and gas industry. So it's forward looking. So if markets and businesses get spooked that we're going to have another, we're going to have whatever, a policy response from Washington or changes in tax law, or whatever it is, regulations that would impede economic activity, then you would anticipate that demand for oil and gas would fall. Or if you have laws put in place that restrict the use of oil and gas, same impact. So I think the oil markets are forward looking and they respond to what the anticipation is for the broader economy. So I would say that I'm optimistic. I think that once we get past the pandemic, so middle to late next year, we'll quickly rebound back to where we were before, and that means oil and gas demand will also rebound, and that will push up prices as well.
So when you're capturing your data and you're looking at the habits that have been broken, let's take travel and the way people have realized that we don't need to travel as much as we did. Do you think that those behaviors, those patterns will come back, or what? How are you projecting those types of trends?
So I think there's a lot of difficulty in predicting what office habits, like are people going to go back to offices when they've got used to working at home? If you can't hear my kids doing distance learning in the background, I'm very eager to go back to an office, although they'll be at school, so I guess I can have the house to myself. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty on things like that, and then on travel. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of meetings that were in person now. You can see that people might say that it makes sense to do them like we're doing today. But I think there's gonna be a lot of pent up demand to travel and see and interact. And that goes for business and it goes for personal, to see family and friends, to just get out of the house and get out of your local area and then just to get back in face-to-face with colleagues. So I think there'll definitely be, I think the two things will be going on. One is that the shift to this being more normal, like, you know, I just pop onto this to do a presentation rather than travel. I think there's gonna be some of that. Also, there's gonna be a countervailing effect of, like, you know, that was a tough year and a half, and we don't want to go back to that. And we still want to get together and see each other. And there's an element to just human nature. A lot of businesses transact it face to face and just gets done because you're chatting at the reception afterwards, and that can't be done on Zoom.
That's right.
As much as I've done this and tried to be social, at least from my experience, it's fine for events for this. It works great, but in terms of the personal interaction and the socializing, this isn't going to hack it.
Yeah, we're hearing that too. I noticed in your Q4 the 5.4% projected growth. How is the elections playing into that? What is the historical references when we look at Q4 in a presidential election?
So I would say that there's two different things to look at. There's financial markets, and then there's the growth estimates. Growth estimates are not going to take into account election impacts right now. What's going to drive those estimates is the virus. So that's saying that the virus continues to fall, we get real activity in the economy, and we continue the growth. Now, financial markets what are they pricing in? That's a little different. Are they pricing in? To me, that they're starting to price in a full Democratic control. So they're pricing in now a Biden presidency with a Democratic Senate, and of course, continuing Democratic control of the House. What they probably haven't priced in, and they need to start pricing in, and then businesses need to start preparing for, is if that occurs, they're likely to wipe the filibuster, and you're going to have large shifts in public policy. So there'll be large shifts in taxes and regulation. And there'll be certainly, in some matters of taxes, there'll be certainly some kind of environmental bill, whether it's a carbon tax or cap and trade, whatever it's going to be. They will likely do that. I don't think the markets have fully priced that in. And then forecasts like this aren't going to price that in, because that's just, when does it get passed? When does it become effective? It's too hard to put that in right now. And even then, it would still be in the 2022 at the earliest. So if an economic forecast isn't going to look at that, market changes will, and like I said, priced in for Democratic control, but not for the agenda that they're likely to enact.
Okay, all right. Just want to make sure if there's any other questions. We do have a couple of more minutes, and then, because I know Curtis has kids behind him going, Dad, I need help. Just want to goof off. Any other questions coming in? Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, Curtis, we really do appreciate your time. Do you have any closing comments or things that you'd like to share with us?
No, thank you. I'm happy to be here and happy to do this in the future. Just keep in mind, again, the high level things of the economy is likely to continue as it is right now, which is that those businesses that can operate are doing so and are doing okay. There remains a sizable number of them on the bottom of that K, which will require a targeted response from Washington at some point, the phase 4 legislation that they have not completed right now. So it's both businesses and the workers in those industries, right? So if you're if you're the airline industry, or you're in tourism, and the motion picture industry has lost 50% of its jobs compared to February. If you're in those industries that just can't, the theaters announced yesterday, I think that they're closing again. Mm-hmm. That the phase 4 legislation really needs to target on those industries that just can't operate during a pandemic, and so that should inform that. But again, takeaways: I'm optimistic about the economy, which I don't think I got into it. The one caveat I should add is that no one knows what would happen if we had a secondary lockdown. So if we had to go into another, I call it the great pause, if we had to go into another one because of resurgence of the virus, all the things I talked about of no imbalances or bubbles being exposed, that all bets are off. I don't know what would happen with a secondary lockdown. But as long as we avoid that, I think by the middle of next year, we're talking about a very strong economy and really strong growth, and we're poised for that. But again, the virus really drives that. So thank you. Very happy to be here again. Happy to do it again.
Thank you, Curtis. So as we transition into our next speaker, I want to just mention a couple of things. Early voting begins October 13th here in Longview. We'll go through October 20th. So if you're thinking about voting, need materials, let us know. We want to help you make a well-informed decision because we want to keep our economy rolling. We believe and support the free market system. The next thing is tonight we do have our city council forum. It will be live, and then we'll have it available on tape as well. That'll begin at 6 o'clock here this evening. You can register for the council forum on our website at longviewchamber.com. Just pop over to the calendar section. You'll go down and you'll just register with our go-to meeting, and you can watch live as we interact with the city council race for this evening. So that'll be a fun and dynamic forum. Next on our agenda, we have Mr. Marty Durbin. And I am Marty, if you'll tell us a little bit about your role with the U.S. Chamber, and then we want to hear what you're thinking about the election outcomes that are coming up. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Happy to join in, and always good to follow Curtis too, to give you a sense of where things are on the economy. So, I serve as a president of the Global Energy Institute at the U.S. Chamber. But my team, my staff team, we manage both the Global Energy Institute plus our energy and environment committees, and now I oversee all of our climate-related and sustainability-related policy work as well, at least helping align all of those different sustainability efforts across the chamber, because it comes in many different places. So that's why I also see it. It gave me a separate title of Senior Vice President for Policy, because I'm helping out in a broader sense as well. What I wanted to do, I know, was asked to give an energy outlook too, so I'll kind of jump to that at the beginning here, and then it all gets tied together as we get into what are the potential election outcomes. But in the short term, for the remainder of this Congress, we don't expect a lot to happen on the energy front. There is one really significant bill that we've been promoting for 2 years. We did a key vote letter last week, and this is if you've been following it, it's an energy and climate innovation legislation, bipartisan. Chairman Murkowski in the Senate and Ranking Member Manchin did just a really amazing job of taking things through regular order, passing all these bipartisan bills, putting it together in one package. It hit obstacles along the way, but we continue to lean in and help get through those. So that now, because of the Senate going out for the next couple of weeks because of COVID infections, it now looks like if that's going to happen, it'll happen in the lame duck session. But nonetheless, we'll see. That I'm holding out hope, and we're working with all the leadership there to get that one done. Looking into next year, I'm not yet making predictions about the election outcome. We'll get into more of that, but I think from an energy standpoint, and what we're looking at is the major issues that we're focused on. Number one, let's just be clear, is the potential for restrictions on energy production. We get into whether or not you think Vice President Biden has said he would ban fracking or not. I tend to think he won't, but there's a lot of other things he can do short of that would limit production on federal lands and other regulatory actions he can take. Again, we can get more into that, but that's one of the major areas we'll be looking at. Secondly, is what types of climate policies might we see coming? And I don't think it's going to happen quickly, but we do have to look at things like carbon pricing, emission reduction mandates or additional mandates on that, and of course subsidies and incentives for chosen energy sources of various kinds. And then finally, I just say that looking at, I think we will have a major infrastructure package. But when that comes along, it's not just going to be roads and bridges. It's going to be climate. It's going to be environmental justice. It's going to be the whole ball of wax as they get into that. Now there's some opportunities in there for us as well with regard to permitting reform. But nonetheless, but at front end, say that's a kind of the short term and longer term, the issues we're looking at more specifically in the energy space. what I wanted to do is I'm going to go through some slides here, and I'll go through them quickly. This is kind of a condensed version of a longer presentation that Neil Bradley, it was kind of the brainchild, my boss at the chamber, to help put this together. And we worked with staff all over the building to kind of put the pieces together. But as you'll see, it all kind of fits into what do we need to be watching, what do we need to be looking for as we go ahead. Now, Kelly, I'm sorry, I don't know if I have control of the slides or if I just need to ask for go to the next slide.
You're in control.
And so I'm in control, but where is the? I'm trying to see where. What was that? No, that goes to. I apologize, Kelly. Oh, there. I don't know if I did, someone else did.
All right, Steph.
You can just use your arrow keys to move forward through the presentation.
Well, that's what I was trying, and nothing's moving.
Let me click back on it. Try it now.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Apologies for the delay here. So again, capture both the federal and state level, and then we're three different scenarios we were looking at. One is essentially the status quo: the president's reelected and the Republicans retain the Senate. The second is if Vice President Biden wins, but the Republicans still retain the Senate. So we have split in the Congress, and of course the third is the complete Democratic control on both sides. So thinking, we go back in time here and look at the elections going back to all the way back to 1960, and since then, when did we see big change elections? So that either the White House flipped or one or both parties or chambers in Congress flipped. As you see through the first 20 years or more, it didn't happen every time, and it was almost the exception, not the rule. But since 2000, nearly every election has been a change election of one kind. And by the way, I did provide these slides, so you'll be able to look back at them after the fact as well. So just a sense that we've been flipping back and forth, as I'm sure you've all noticed, much more frequently in the last 20 years. When we do have unified government, that's when some big things get done. So whether you're going back to family medical leave and deficit reduction, or George W. Bush and his initial tax cut, later Medicare drug issues, bankruptcy reform, of course with President Obama, you had the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, and with President Trump in his first 2 years, we saw tax reform and reform of Dodd-Frank went back. So just a note that unified government does allow for big things to happen. Putting this up here because as you'll see in one of our scenarios, if we get to unified democratic government, our assumption is that the legislative filibuster will be taken away. And that's the rule that requires 60 votes to be able to move legislation. That's already been removed. It was initially removed for judicial nominations below the Supreme Court, and then of course in the last Congress, it was removed for Supreme Court nominations, which allowed Republicans to move the last two Supreme Court nominees with just 51 votes. So our assumption, it's possible that there are going to be enough votes to maintain, even among Democrats, maintain the legislative filibuster, but we're just assuming that it goes away. And in some ways, what that means is we have to do our job better of building the coalitions necessary, to get good policy done. This is just an indication, as you've all seen, when we do have a change in a White House, some people call it a snapback, or what does the current president now do to reverse what the previous president did? And this shows more of the what's easier and what's harder. It's very easy on the first day to get rid of executive orders from your predecessor. You can work the guidance documents within regulations, or you could then getting harder and harder. You can redo regulations, which takes takes a lot of time, and then of course you can try to get legislation passed, which takes even longer. So it's just that continuum of difficulty. Of course, as we all know, we're not just divided at the federal level; we're divided among the states as well. this shows you over time here, where it used to be the norm or the rule that states were had split control with it, whether governor and the legislature having a split, and now, as you see, that's not the case anymore. And this shows you kind of where those the unified states are, both for the Republicans, Democrats, and then and the ones who are split. that will come into play here in a moment here as we start to look at. But if you take a look at those states, and you'll see how things like population or private employment and consumer spending, all those things, how that splits out in among those different states. It's a little bit of a continuation of the discussion where you can say that the Senate, for example, Republicans are in control, but the states that they are from, with 53 senators, only represents 45% of the population of the country. So this just goes to show where you'll see some of those issues play out at the at the state level. Of course, we've seen the polarization among state attorneys general, and what this slide essentially tells you is that normally you didn't see, or historically you didn't see, where state attorneys general were taking political stands or suits against the federal government. If you had multi-states getting together to sue the federal government, it was because they thought the federal government was getting into the state's jurisdiction. As we've seen over time, it's become more and more partisan. So state attorneys general of one party get together and fight against a president of the other party, and we certainly saw that spike in the current administration. And again, unfortunately, we would expect to see that going forward as well. So as I said, we look at the scenarios. The first one being essentially status quo. Our belief, again, high level assumptions, is that there's still going to be lack of a clear agenda. We're going to have legislative gridlock, which means that the two things. One, the president is going to, a re-elected president will always feel more emboldened, both at home and abroad. But we'll, as we'll talk about in a moment, to extend, use the authority of the executive branch to get more of his agenda done. Now, on the third point there about increased blue state activity, that goes back to our discussion of the states. Even if things are gridlocked at the federal level, Democrat-controlled states are become even more active than they have been on areas like the environment or climate or labor policy or all kinds of other things. I mean, it's been a trend already over the last decade at least, and I think we would see that continue and perhaps even accelerate. So again, as I mentioned, in this particular scenario, that the president would try to cement and even expand the regulatory reforms and the the deregulation that the Trump administration has successfully put in place during its time here. We'll see, as I said before, increased use of executive actions. A president in their second term will tend to focus on foreign affairs, and we would expect that to happen if the president is reelected. And as I said, with state actions, you could see an accelerated activity on areas where the federal government is going to be either in gridlock or working against where those various state officials would like the policy to be. So the second scenario is a Biden win, but Congress remains split. And here, we would expect a president of a new party. If he's going to look and say, I'm not likely to get what I want through Congress, so I'm going to aggressively use the executive branch and my presidential actions to move my agenda. So as I noted on the earlier slide, very early on, you can reverse executive orders that exist. You can sign your own. You can start to give guidance to federal agencies. one of the things we note here is that it's going to be an importance of sub-cabinet positions. And what we mean by that is that the legislative gridlock in Congress is going to extend to nominations. So anyone that a President Biden nominates for Secretary of whatever or all those other confirmable positions, they're going to run into problems. And we saw that in the current administration. So we may have a lot of open or acting positions. So personnel is policy, as sometimes say, and so it'll be important who is sitting in those second level positions as well. The federal government does have a lot of authority on using its procurement policy, so again, expect that. And as noted about the state attorneys general before, if you have a Democratic president, you can expect Republican attorneys general to become more active in pushing back against policies of the administration. So again, just saying that would reverse existing executive orders, suspend non-final regulatory actions if they hadn't been done yet, and then decide where they want to set their markers and targets for moving their own regulations, and eventually trying to get to the legislative side as well. But again, on that procurement policy, Buy America policy type things, and others like that. You could see that there are proposals that the vice president's campaign has put out about not just Buy American, but Buy Clean. So now you're making judgments on energy sources that were used or the products that you're purchasing, what have you. So then under unified democratic control, again, we assumed, as I said, that the filibuster would be repealed, legislative filibuster, which then means everything only needs 51 votes. Again, you do have to get 51, and there are some who believe, and I happen to believe as well, that some Democrats that are going to be elected in the Senate, should they be elected, are not progressive. They're not, AOC type Democrats. They're going to be from states where they won't be able to be as progressive, liberal, whatever label you'd like to put on it. And may be able to help. There are opportunities to help build coalitions on some of our critical issues. But again, we'll see aggressive regulatory action. Enforcement becomes a policy tool, and oversight will certainly take on a bigger role from the Congress. And again, GOP attorneys general will be quite active. So here I'm not going to go through all of these, but it was as we went through as a policy team at the chamber to say, if we have this, what are the kind of the top 3 or 4 issues within 7 broad categories that we believe we are most vulnerable to? I should say in some cases we're both vulnerable or we have opportunities because we may have alignment. Clearly, as you've probably seen, the U.S. Chamber hasn't been always aligned with the current administration on trade policy or immigration policy and some other things as well. So would we potentially have some alignment with either a new administration or a Democratic-controlled Congress? But by and large, there are some real significant concerns, whether things like the PRO Act and treatment of independent contractors and those types of things. Going on to tax issues. Obviously, for the energy industry, the tax issues are a huge issue. It did well in the 2017 tax bill that came through, and if the campaign promises are any indication, I think we can expect some changes in that should we have unified democratic control. And as I noted at the front end, there's kind of 3 major areas in the infrastructure, energy, and environment. What does that infrastructure package look like? Because it will have climate, environmental justice, and other issues with it. How far will they or can they go on things like carbon pricing and further climate policies? And of course, what types of restrictions might there be put on domestic energy production, especially in the oil and gas space? Again, we also looked at technology and some of the health and retirement issues as well. But again, I won't go through each of those, but I did leave the slides for you to have as well. Trade issues will of course be big, regardless of the election outcome. And I think that's it. So Kelly, I'd be more than happy to take your questions or others.
Thank you very much. This is, I'm going to get situated back in my camera. Very interesting information, Marty, and I appreciate you walking through it. The potential for restrictions on the energy production, of course, is very concerning for Texas with being an energy state. Recently, we had a fail at our, for our community on wind production. We went before the PUC. So those are types of things that we're continually monitoring and looking at, and we want to protect our business environment because it is what drives our economy. I mean, the virus has had horrible impacts across the country, but what oil and gas is still doing in our area, these dips, it's tough. I mean, that's the reality, and to add these additional regulations is why we're aligning with the U.S. Chamber, with our state chamber, and we'll continue to fight to protect these types of businesses. So I appreciate you bringing that up. The types of climate policies on carbon pricing and things, can you go back and just review that a little bit more, because that's a bit confusing.
Well, and again, it is confusing because there's no clear guide, no clear sense of what type of policy might be pursued. As you know, even some in the oil and gas industry are now parts of organizations that are saying we're for a carbon tax if it's a tax and dividend, or if it's so it's not adding to that, we're sort of giving it back to the people. Obviously, not everybody in the industry is on board with that. But carbon pricing is a much broader. A carbon tax in some ways is simple. Say, okay, you put a tax on carbon. If you make it economy wide, if it's, people still differ greatly on whether you should do that or not. But it is, you can say it's market based. If it's economy wide, it's not hitting one part or another. Okay, but there are others, even in the environmental community, that said, yeah, we don't need the carbon tax. Let's jump past that, and we think we'll do better if we just regulate, and continue to just say, mandate that emissions have to keep going down. At the chamber, we focused more on, regardless of what if you want to look at solutions to the climate challenge, no matter how. So what I mean by that is we need to be able to meet the growing energy demand both at home and abroad, and we want to do it with fewer emissions and a lighter carbon footprint. Okay? The only way to get there is if we focus now on this, and as I mentioned at the front end, technology and innovation. So within the oil and gas industry, we've already seen, the shale revolution itself has done more to lower emissions in this country than anything else in such a short time. Mm-hmm. What more are they doing? And they are doing quite a bit to reduce methane emissions. What else can be done in the space of fuels? But the point is, whether it's carbon capture, direct air capture, but then things like battery storage technology, advanced nuclear, grid modernization, all those things are going to be necessary, to be able to address the broader, to decarbonize the economy, to put it that way. But it's just this open sense of, well, I don't know where they're going to go. The proposals are everything from, well, let's just continue to increase taxes on or regulations, or a straight up carbon tax. That, and some of the carbon tax ideas don't go back as a dividend to the people, but will go back into renewable energy technology, or used to subsidize other industries.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one. The other point that I found really interesting, you mentioned the infrastructure package, and then you threw some curves in there. You mentioned some things that, to me, I'm on the infrastructure committee with the U.S. Chamber, and you highlighted some things that could become part of that package that really don't relate to infrastructure. So can you kind of back up and discuss that a bit as well?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you think about historically, every 5 years we have an infrastructure bill. It's roads, bridges, waterways, and that's it. Well, as we saw, the chamber did quite a lot of work in the House, this year, trying to help get a bipartisan package together that was really focused on infrastructure. And to a large extent, we were able to do that as far as what came out of committee. But then when they took the bill to the floor, they added all kinds of climate related. I mean, it already had some climate policies in it, and I understand, and we knew what they were doing. But then they started adding all kinds of other policies coming out of other committees, and we referred to it as subtraction by addition. So they had a coalition that would have passed this bill with broad support in a minute. But because they added all these other things, including, like I mentioned, environmental justice provisions, which is a legitimate issue that's got to be addressed, but it hadn't had the time taken to build the durable bipartisan support to have it done. So essentially, they passed a bill they knew was never going to go anywhere, and we actually sent up a letter saying, essentially, pox on both your houses. What are you doing? You've now you've now ruined a really critical bill by adding all these other things to it. But having said that, I just don't think there's no way we're going to see infrastructure come up next year where it doesn't have these other things attached to it. So one effort that I've been involved in, and in fact, I'm happy to send to you, it was an op-ed and roll call on Friday that I co-signed with Jason Grimay from the Bipartisan Policy Center. And the point here was, how do we build a left-right coalition that says we've got to have infrastructure, but we've also got to address the climate issues. Well, you can't address climate issues if you don't have the infrastructure necessary to do that. So whether it's for renewable energy or for oil and natural gas, we've got to build infrastructure, and we can't do that unless we have a permitting process that makes sense. When it takes 7 years to get a yes or no answer to build a highway, you can't get anything done. And there's lots of other horror stories about things taking 14 years, 20 years, to be able to get any kind of project done. So it's more, how do we build we've got to build a durable coalition here where those who are pushing for climate policy say, yeah, I get it, we also need to have the infrastructure side of this. And those on the infrastructure side are saying, yeah, we got to be able to address climate issues. Mm-hmm. So I would tell you that's where we're focused, at least on trying to find that sweet spot.
So as we prepare post-election, any advice?
Well, given the way 2020 has come at us here, I'd say just hold on to your hats right now. I mean, we were having this conversation on Friday about how we were going to get this. I mentioned the innovation bill, how we were going to get it done in the Senate this week. We thought we were going to be able to get time on the floor, and then by the end of the day Friday, with the president's diagnosis and 3 senators, and suddenly, nope, Senate's not coming back until October 19th. Now anything legislatively is going to have to be in the lame duck session. Well, that's going to be fraught with the Supreme Court nominee to start with. But they do have to pass another continuing resolution or a budget, for 2021. It runs out December 11th. That will always be, that's going to be the last train moving. So from a policy standpoint, can we get onto that bill? And Curtis mentioned it before, but will we get a phase 4? I think we desperately need a phase 4 relief bill, and better that it comes before the election, because I think incentive might go out after the election to send relief checks to people.
Yeah, it's gonna be an interesting watch, definitely. And we need more clarity on some of the things that have already been enacted on. So exactly. It's interesting times. Well, Marty, any closing comments? I think we've covered our questions and want to make sure we've given you your time.
No, absolutely. No, again, I appreciate the invitation to be here. Happy to answer, follow-up questions on anything, again, in those slides, or specific energy issues that are coming up. I know your final conversation with Curtis on the oil and gas industry, of course, my background, API and ANGA. Yeah, it's all about demand. You got to get the economy going again. And the one other thing, it's not just about the economy here, clearly for you in Texas. It's the export market.
Yes.
Both from an oil and natural gas standpoint. That's critical. So we can start to see other parts of the world coming back online and having the agreements we need. And frankly, on a natural gas standpoint, that's also a great climate message as well. Putting cleaner fuels out there, from the U.S.
Yes.
But anyhow, I will leave you with, but again, thank you.
We sure do appreciate your time, and we appreciate the engagement from our audience. So we're going to do a little commercial as we transition from Marty to Kris. Just as a reminder, we will be going to DC. All plans are moving forward for this spring. So if you'd like information on how to join our in-person DC fly-ins, we spend a morning at the U.S. Chamber with experts like what we're hearing from today. We do our legislative visits typically that afternoon on the Hill. The next day, we bring in other association executives that are on issues that are impacting the East Texas market. And then we do some more Hill visits that afternoon. So we spend 2 days of quality time in DC building relationships, learning, and then messaging back to our elected officials. And we always have a great time with our congressman who gives us a tour of different facilities with the history lesson with it. So Congressman Gohmert is always a part of that. Senator Cornyn as well makes significant time for us and visits with us, and those are excellent visits. And maybe by this spring we'll be able to get back in to see Senator Cruz as well. So I hope you will be watching for the dates on our DC fly-in for spring of 2021 as our market reopens. Tonight, we have our City Council Forum at 6 o'clock. So you can go on our website, longviewchamber.com, click on calendar and today's events, and you can register for the meeting this evening and watch virtually the City Council Forum as we ask questions that impact our local business economy right here in Longview, Texas. So I just want to say thank you again for being with us. Now I am going to turn the meeting over to Kris Denzel. Kris is the Senior Director of International Policy, and sometimes in Longview, Texas, we forget the impact of the international market on our economy, especially with energy being one of those driving forces in our strong manufacturing industrial base that we have. So trade and tariffs is one of great interest. It always ignites some interesting conversation, Kris. So I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Kelly, thank you so much for that. And thanks for the invitation today. And I apologize for the backdrop. I was telling Stephanie and the team yesterday, we just moved, so I don't necessarily have a Zoom set up yet, but we're working on it. But really appreciate the time to be here today. I'll run through some slides, maybe take about 10, 15 minutes, and then Kelly, to your point, would love to take some questions from folks. So, when we kind of look at the big picture here in the trade and investment space, it's obviously been interesting. It was interesting before the pandemic, but now you layer on the issues of the pandemic, obviously the upcoming election, and it makes for an interesting landscape. So if we step back here, we look at let's look at before the coronavirus, right? Before the pandemic, right? We did have some success in Q1 of this year. Obviously, we had the USMCA, which entered into force on July 1, which was voted through Congress earlier in the year, and we did have the Phase 1 agreement with China. Obviously, those commodity purchases have lagged, but the numbers are ticking up. I know they're ticking up in energy and petrochemicals, but it still remains a challenge. So certainly COVID kind of threw everything off the rails here. We saw obviously supply and demand drops. The WTO has said that trade in goods is at its lowest level since 2007, which is obviously very concerning. And then that third bullet point there is one that we've been tracking, written extensively on, but this is growing trade protectionism, specifically as it relates to medical goods and pharmaceuticals, right? We saw export barriers go up where folks weren't sending, active pharmaceutical ingredients that you need to make drugs, for example, or weren't sending PPE around. So it's something that we're tracking very closely. Obviously, we argue against that because we want, huge, large supply chains that are diverse, that are resilient, that are able to respond to crises in time. Certainly also high tariffs remain in place. Those are on steel and aluminum. Those are on imports from China, for example. U.S.-China relationship continues to deteriorate, which has some new interesting facets with the conversation on TikTok and WeChat and a few other items that we'll cover. And then we do still have a variety of trade negotiation ongoing, right? The Trump administration is actively engaged in a number of trade negotiations that they've carried over through the pandemic. And so we'll touch on those as well. I put this slide up. It came up a few weeks ago, but I think it kind of captures the moment that we're in. And there was some new trade data that came out today that showed that the U.S. trade deficit has grown to its largest levels, and that the WTO and the OECD, right, so these big, folks that track economics at the macro global level, are predicting obviously a dip this year, and then in 2021 we'll see a rebound here Certainly it's not going to be equal for everyone. I know you all talked with Curtis this morning. He probably talked about the K-shaped recovery, so it's not going to be equal for everyone. But the forecasters, both here, obviously in the States and then globally are all predicting a rebound here looking into next year. A level playing field. I put this up here because, as I mentioned, the Trump administration obviously still going through a variety of trade negotiations. We'd like to see some more of those. We'd like to see, the U.S. get back on a positive trade footing where we're signing, more free and fair trade deals that do open up markets for petrochemicals, gas, manufactured products, you name it. Because our trading partners haven't stood still during the pandemic, right? They've continued to sign trade deals, but we still recognize the amount, the huge amounts of challenges that our exporters face, particularly, in China and other parts of Asia with this, the subsidies, the forced localization, the intellectual property theft, you name it. So tariffs, as I mentioned, still on the books. We still have a bevy of tariffs on a variety of products here. I know there was some back and forth, with these aluminum tariffs on Canada, right? So they were in place. Then they came off as a condition of, entering into the USMCA, right? The renegotiated NAFTA. Trump administration put them back on subsequently, and then recently just took them off. So I know that back and forth certainly doesn't help folks, when we're all trying to drive for at least some sort of certainty in these uncertain times. And then we still do have a healthy amount of tariffs on Chinese goods. And, the Trump administration continues to talk about additional tariffs. Here's a few other ones. And these are important, obviously, because of the tariffs themselves, but also because of the retaliation that our trading partners impose on us when we put these on. So there's still, a lot out there. The president continues to talk about auto tariffs. We believe that there would need to be a new investigation for those to continue. We could talk about the procedure there, but there are other varieties of ongoing investigations. You see those Section 232s. Those are the national security investigations that the administration used to put tariffs on steel and aluminum. So they're looking at things like mobile crane imports and the parts there, the transformer core and parts there, as well as some other products, including vanadium, which I know is big for the aerospace industry. They're looking at others in response to some actions some of our partners are taking. I'm happy to talk about those. And then this bottom point here, we can maybe talk about this when we talk about, trying to forecast the election here, but both candidates, right? So Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden have both talked about somehow imposing a tariff or a new tax on companies that quote unquote offshore operations. So we think it's something to pay attention to. So as I mentioned, one of the kind of the bright spots of Q1 was the USMCA, the renegotiated NAFTA. I just put it up here just to remind folks that it happened because it seems like a lifetime ago, but the work still continues. So it entered into force on July 1, right? So that's when the deal took hold, but there's still some work that needs to be done between the three trading partners, but also here in the States. And this will come in the form of what's called a technical corrections bill because there were some errors that have been uncovered. I know one big for the manufacturing folks out there is this merchandise processing fee. Certainly there's also a continued conversation on some issues related to foreign trade zones, for example, as well. I know Mr. Corden's been pretty on top of that. But I think that this was an important exercise, because we had huge majorities of members of Congress support trade. And certainly this may be inherently a little different because it was a renegotiated deal and not an existing deal. And it's certainly important because it's our backyard as well. But there were some very good chapters in there, certainly related to digital trade, remanufactured goods, a few others. Not to say, in our assessment, the agreement was perfect. We think it came up short in a few areas. But nevertheless, it was important to continue to preserve the North American trading bloc and strengthen where we could because, NAFTA came online 94, 95, and certainly we've had the advent of the internet and other things subsequently since then. So we needed to bring the trade deal up to the 21st century. And I think, what's obviously good about this, I referenced the digital trade chapter here a lot. It's important to every sector, every industry, right? But what the Trump administration has done is take those best-in-class provisions and then translate it to other trade deals, right? So we talk about, our negotiations with, the United Kingdom, for example, right? That's going to be the starting point. China, obviously continues to have news every day about the relationship. Certainly, this is not just, from our lane. Certainly, we look at the trade relationship, but it's much more important than that, much more complex and deep than that. So we did have the phase 1 agreement. Those purchase commitments, right? So when we look at things like ag, we look at other commodities, we look at oil, gas, we look at manufactured goods. Those numbers certainly have been impacted by the coronavirus. And recall when we got this phase 1 with China, it was fairly limited in nature, right? It certainly addressed a lot of issues, but didn't go whole hog, right? It didn't go after some of these longstanding issues that the business community has talked about, whether that's, the forced localization of efforts, or whether that's the theft of intellectual property. So, the Trump administration continues to push forward with this. This phase 2, right, where we have a comprehensive deal with China is now, well visible beyond the horizon. I think, the effort right now is just to make sure that the phase 1 remains intact. And then there has been a variety of other measures, like I mentioned, that do impact this relationship. Obviously we had the Houston consulate closure. We've had a number of visa restrictions, and then the administration has used sanctions, export controls, investment screen reviews, concerns obviously about human rights. Congress has passed a few bills on there, and you also have, what played out in Hong Kong with the removal of autonomy there. So this is all to say it's a complex relationship, certainly one that is vastly important, to the U.S. given the significant amount of business that we do with China, but one that I think, obviously we were going to continue paying attention to. But then you look at the campaign trail, both Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden both have talked extensively about the future of U.S.-China relations. So what's next for trade? So obviously I mentioned Trump administration is continuing here with a variety of trade negotiations: India, Brazil, Kenya, UK, European Union. I put this title as the era of the mini deal. And I kind of reference this because, what we've seen, with the Trump administration, whether that was with China that I just mentioned, Japan, or South Korea, they've done these executive agreements, these mini trade deals that, don't have to go through Congress like USMCA does. So that means that they're not comprehensive. They lack certain enforcement mechanisms. And that's really what we're looking at here with these, at least the first two, India and Brazil. I think this month we'll probably see movement on Brazil. This is going to be a limited agreement, one that's, nevertheless important. We would love for it to be comprehensive, but we're looking at things there like trade facilitation, anti-corruption, good regulatory practices, certainly moving the ball forward in that relationship. That's important. The Kenya and the UK, those are comprehensive negotiations. Obviously, a little bit of a dance going on with the UK as they continue with Brexit with the EU, and then obviously we have our own relationship with the EU. But those talks continue to move forward pretty seriously, and I think that will be a fairly high standard agreement if we can overcome some long-standing issues that we have on the healthcare front, for example, or on the ag export front, for example, as well. Other trade issues that we're tracking pretty closely here, we do want to see the completion of the talks with Japan and China. We want those to be big, beautiful, comprehensive trade deals. The World Trade Organization is going, obviously, as many of you will recall, through some issues right now. They're looking for a new leader, a new director general. We've hosted a variety of those candidates, and they continue to narrow down that field as they look for a new head over there. But then also, there's a number of issues that, the business community, the Trump administration, and others have raised with the World Trade Organization about efforts to modernize it, right? To make it work better. And that's something that we continue to look at. Trade Promotion Authority. So this is the law that Congress passes that allows the administration to go out and negotiate trade deals and then bring them back to Congress for a simple up and down vote. That expires next year. So that has to be renewed at some point. That expires in June. And that's obviously, was a tough fought battle last time. And I would expect the same next year, especially depending upon what happens in November, what the outcome of all those races are, both House, Senate, and White House. Sanctions, export controls, something that, I've been spending a lot of time working on lately this year, just because we've seen an uptick in their use, an uptick in Congress's interest in the matter. And those, obviously impact our ability to export. Miscellaneous tariff bill, hugely important for manufacturers. That appears to be moving in the right direction. If you recall, the Congress went through and created a new system to process those tariff relief lines. So that appears to be trending in the right direction. Supply chains. I'm happy to talk more about this later in Q&A, Kelly, but it's something that we've done a lot of work on. And there was always an ongoing conversation, right, with respect to supply chains, but certainly the pandemic pushed it to the forefront, right? And this really started out as this conversation about medicine and medical goods. I mentioned the trade barriers that were put in place by over 80 countries, including the United States. But this conversation now has blossomed outward, especially as we talk about our relationship with China as well, to include things like semiconductors, to include things like rare earth minerals. So, I think there are two conversations here, right? Obviously, companies, as part of the pandemic and as part of just ongoing good business practice, we're always looking at their supply chains, right? And then you have this policy conversation that's been initiated by both Congress and the White House. as to what they want to see, right? What they want to mandate, right? And this is kind of where a lot of our work kicks in about, certain mandates that require X be produced here or Y be produced somewhere else. So it's a big part of our work. It is certainly, immensely consequential, especially as, not only our member companies, weather the COVID storm, but as they look not only to the return to work, but then also out towards the future, because they have to do, obviously, what's in their best interest, but then there also might be some mandates handed down by the federal government, either from the executive or from Congress, or a combination of the both, that will certainly impact their decision making and their 5, 10, 15-year forecasts. I know Marty talked about the election. Let me state up front, I am not an expert in elections. I don't forecast. My crystal ball has been broken for many years, but we are planning for it. We are looking at what would these, the variety of the outcomes mean for trade and investment policy, something we're thinking long and hard about. We're talking with both camps about this as well. And I think, you get very different outcomes depending on the scenario, or depending on the outcome of the election, Kelly, that will impact, not only the ongoing trade negotiations, but future trade negotiations, right? Because obviously from our standpoint, we want to get back on the positive footing. As I mentioned, we want the U.S. to get back in the business of signing more free trade deals, because, we do have a significant number less free trade agreements than a lot of our trading partners. So we want to get there. We obviously want the tariffs to come down as well. That's not to say that we want folks to abuse the system, right? If folks are, let's say, engaging in unscrupulous behavior, we want those folks to be held accountable. But, insofar as some of the tariffs that we've seen, we would like those to come down, because obviously we know who pays those. We know the business disruptions that we cause. We know the uncertainty that it causes in many cases. So this is something we're taking a hard look at, much as we did, with the 2016 election as well. But it could have a pretty big impact, I think, because, I think if you look at, let's say it's status quo maintains, right, in that first scenario, as I mentioned, trade promotion authorities got to get reauthorized, which would be a tough battle on any given year in any given scenario to get that through Congress. And then, I think the president will continue with his trade negotiations. I think that we could see additional tariffs. And if you look at the, the opposite side of that coin, let's say for example, where Mr. Biden wins, I think domestic policy becomes the focus there early on. And maybe some of those trade negotiations take a back seat. But Kelly, let me stop there. Let me take questions. And once again, really appreciate the invitation to speak today.
I appreciate this. I'm sitting here thinking where to begin with the questions. All right, Kris? So
I'm sorry, I knew that was a lot, but there's a lot happening right now.
There is a lot happening. So you talked about the positive trade footage. What you also mentioned the challenges that are there. Can you go a little bit more in depth about the challenges we're facing?
Yeah, I think a lot of these are long-standing, right? So let's take U.S.-China relationship, for example, Kelly. I mean, obviously we look at, the state-owned enterprises, the subsidies that China provides to their national champions. You look at the requirements that our businesses have, right? The lack of market access. Folks just can't go over there and set up shop, right? They have to have a partner in China, or they have to give over their data or something along those lines, which are, hugely problematic to our companies. So you take a look at that. You take a look at the new trade barriers, as I mentioned, that are going up as countries look to, secure their supply of PPE, for example. But then you take a look at the opportunities, right? Because, there have been other countries that have signed trade deals, have continued on their negotiations like we have. But we just want to get back on that positive trade footing, right? Because I think if it's one thing that we learned here, one thing that we continue to examine, as we continue to look at the pandemic, is that we want our supply chains to be resilient. We want them to be diversified, right? Because, let's say you only made, PPE masks in one plant in, let's say Iowa, for example, right? And if that went down, then you don't have another supply, right? So you want to make sure that's diversified. Obviously, you want to secure the national strategic stockpile. You want to have a robust domestic supply and be able to ramp that up and down. But that doesn't mean, just closing it down to one location. And that's obviously an extreme example, but it's just one that I like to toss out there. So I think we need to be cognizant of the challenges that still haven't been addressed, but then also continue to look for these new opportunities. And I think those kind of work hand in hand, right? If you take a look at the China example, it's tough to go it alone in that case, right? We would like to be working with our partners. We'd like to be working with our allies. What's the best way to do that? Let's not hit them with tariffs, but let's sign trade deals and let's collaborate with them to solve the big question that is the China relationship.
So one of the things I find interesting is the lack of awareness amongst people in the marketplace as far as how much our country actually exports versus imports. Do you have those stats in front of you?
I don't. I was just trying to pull them up, but my email isn't working right now. But certainly, we take in more than we export right now, but that's not true. Obviously, like our services, for example, or energy, some energy products, for example, right? And it's a give and a take. And I know that obviously over the last 4 years, there's been a lot of focus on the trade deficit, right? And what does that mean? But certainly our companies need stuff. They need widgets, right, to put in their products that they export, but also our consumers, they buy a lot of stuff, which is great because we have a nice purchasing power. But yeah, no, it's only gonna increase in importance, right, Kelly? Because 95, 96% of all consumers don't live in the United States of America. We'd like for all of our companies to be able to ship them stuff and for them to buy stuff, so folks can reinvest here, folks can conduct more R&D here, folks can hire here, and that's ideally what we want. But we gotta make sure that there's that level playing field, as I mentioned, and certainly as the president has expounded upon as well.
Well, and I think that's an important point, is that 95% or more of the customers are outside of the U.S. And that's why we have to have robust trade agreements. And they have to be fair, but we have to have them. Let's go into the foreign trade zone discussion, since that's one of our senator's hot topics that he's very aggressive in.
Yeah, no, it will be interesting to see how it works out. So there was a provision in NAFTA, right, that looked at what qualifies for special treatment under NAFTA, right? Is it things inside the FTZ or is it things outside of the FTZ? Now, when Congress passed the USMCA, they wrote a new statute, right? They repealed the NAFTA statute, put in the USMCA statute, and that provision was left out, right? And there's a lot of finger pointing right now about what happened there, but nevertheless, it was left out, and that's current law. So some folks, including the administration, want to put that back in, saying that items either brought into or manufactured in the FTZ would not essentially count for special purposes under USMCA and receive that special benefit. Folks like Mr. Cornyn and others are saying, no, this was left out for a reason, it should remain out. I think Mr. Cornyn's office, what was it they told me the other day, they priced this out. I think it comes out to be about a $2 billion change if we were to revert to the way that these components were treated under NAFTA. So certainly it's a big issue for folks that are in the FTZ, have an FTZ or what have you. I think at the end of the day, the whole goal behind USMCA was to obviously increase investment, increase production here in the States, but also strengthen the trading bloc that we have. I mean, you take a look at something like, an auto engine, in a lot of cases, they'll jump across the border 6, 7, 8 times before it's finished, put into a finished vehicle to be exported. For example. So making sure that we have that seamless trade and we can do that as frictionless as possible is obviously, immensely important, because, many companies have set up their supply chains to take advantage of NAFTA, right, to use that tariff-free movement of goods. Since '94, they've made a lot of business decisions, and they continue to make those. And I like to use the auto sector just because it's, obviously one of our most important exporting manufacturing sectors. But, you want to start talking about complex supply chains. I've had some conversations with those folks that just make my head explode about how this all comes together. How do I get my car in my front yard? Or how does my repair guy get the part that he needs to fix my vehicle? It's impressive. It is very impressive. And we just want to make sure that we're making everyone's lives easier. But, USMCA, just kind of continuing with the auto, that had a big change there, right? You look at the novel concepts of USMCA, kind of the new parameters that were set up. Autos and labor were the two biggest ones, and when I talk about USMCA not being finished, those are still a work in progress, right? How do we administer those? Obviously autos got a little bit of a reprieve here, about 6 months, give or take, to fully enforce some of the new labor requirements, some of the new content requirements, steel, aluminum, those types of things. So it's still a work in progress, still something that we have to actively keep an eye on. But we just want to make sure that USMCA is fully realized, because it is that important to us.
Well, and the reason I bring up the foreign trade zone is some people may not realize we have 2 zones in Longview, or in Gregg County. We have our airport, and then we have one within our city limits. So staying abreast of what's happening with the foreign trade zone and protecting the things that were left out,
right,
impacts businesses' bottom line, and that we want to see them grow and grow jobs. So that's a great investment by having that asset here in town.
Yeah, folks, obviously, this is probably your experience, but it's not like you just call someone and you set up an FTZ, right? There's an entire process, and then, once you get that approval, then, to your point, Kelly, in the surrounding local communities, obviously there's a buildup, right, of jobs, of services, what have you. So they are the anchors of a lot of communities, and I think it's something that's going to take a little bit of time. It's the last thing that's really holding up this conversation about Congress passing this technical corrections bill to USMCA, because there isn't alignment on it. I think we tried to push before this FTZ issue. Really, we wanted this done earlier, but we just want to make sure that it's done right. And Mr. Cornyn's all over it. I know I get a call from his office, and we talked this through a lot, but it is very much an evolving conversation.
So could you go into a little bit more about the digital trade as a part of USMCA? Because I know that's a new component since NAFTA.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Obviously, as I mentioned, we didn't have the internet back then when we signed NAFTA, so it's something that we have to bring up, and it's only increasing importance, right? And I'm not just talking about, our internet companies, Facebooks, Googles, what have you, right? I'm talking about, folks in the ag sector, folks in the oil and gas industry that, rely on data, that rely on algorithms, and I might be, younger here, but I really don't know that. I really can't get into the technical details of it. But when we look at those the digital chapter, Kelly, it's important because we're looking at things that like, the prohibition against localization of data, right? As I was talking about with China, right? Some folks want to say, well, if you want to set up shop here, you've got to leave your data here, right? And that's not always the best situation or setup for a lot of companies. So we want to make sure that there's nothing there that's going to inhibit that free flow of data, right? But then we also need to protect, our trade secrets. We need to protect our IP in the digital space as well. So it's how do we do that? And then, this conversation is also important for our small and medium-sized folks as well, right? So USMCA had its own SME chapter as well. And, another reason obviously USMCA was so important is that, when a small business wants to first start to export, Mexico, Canada, usually it's number 1 or number 2 destinations, right? It makes more sense for someone to ship across our northern or southern border and then go to like, the Maldives or India or somewhere, across the world. So it's very important to that because it's all about securing the data, but then it's also about recognizing it's only going to increase importance, right? And the whole issue is we want to be writing those rules, right? We want to write those with our like-minded allies, right? That take a view of data that is obviously much different than China does, for example. So the digital chapter, also covers things like copyrights as well, which are only going to increase importance. So it was really, hey, how can we get the best? How can we get the gold standard here? But then how can we leverage that to our future negotiations that we have? And I think you look at like something like the UK. Obviously, we're fairly aligned there when it comes to digital trade in a number of issues. So I think it should be pretty easy there to get something that's pretty much at the USMCA standard.
Good. Wow, Kris, this has been really informative, and I laugh and I tell people I'm the ultimate nerd. I love reading and understanding policy and how it impacts our community, and that's why we want to align with the U.S. Chamber on the things that we agree on to help advance this type of work. And trade and tariffs definitely during an election year can bring up some interesting conversations. But people just don't realize how it impacts companies' bottom line and how much comes in and out of our country and into our communities.
Yeah, I think whether we're talking whether we're talking regulations, Kelly, we're talking taxes, whatever the case may be, we really just preach for a level of certainty, right? Because, you take a look at like the aluminum tariffs, for example, they were on, they were off, they were put back on, now they're put back off, but it's, hey, in 4 months, we're also going to take a look at this to see if we need to put them back on. Right. So it's really just how do we get some sort of certainty here, right? Because companies have enough to worry about, especially, even if there wasn't a pandemic, companies got enough to worry about. Now there's a pandemic. Now we're talking about how we get out of it, how we survive, how do we get back to work, how do we grow? That's just an additional layer. And the last thing that we want is, this uncertainty or just B, increased costs.
I hear you. Well, Kris, I sure do appreciate it. I can't wait to where we can come back to DC and have these meetings in person at the U.S. Chamber to strengthen these relationships. So thank you for your time. I appreciate you very, very much.
You know where we're at, Kelly, if you have any questions, and I really do look forward to hosting you all here sometime soon. Hopefully that's sooner rather than later. It's always great to see you guys in person, and then I'd also love to go to the Hill with you guys as well if we can. So let me know what I can do to be helpful.
Okay, thanks, Kris.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's participated in today's Virtual D.C. fly-in. Again, I'd like to thank our key policy investors, Joyce Crane, Southwestern Electric Power Company, an AEP company, Linebarger, Goggin, Blair and Sampson, LLP, our Manley Enterprises, Conterra, and Starfish Ad Agency. So today's presentation has come to an end. I appreciate your time. This will be made available online. We will ship it out to you via email. It'll be on our website, and we appreciate your participation in making Longview a better place. Have a great day.